Welcome everybody to February's Denver and Boulder Java Users Group. I'm Greg Ostrovich, your host for tonight. I'm going to go through some announcements and then we'll get to our speaker. So one of the things is if you have suggestions for topics that you want to see, reach out to myself or to Matt. You can do it through the Meetup site. For tonight's topic, we had the Log4j. I'm sure I'm the only one affected by that, right? And so Matt reached out to a coworker to do tonight's talk on security-related stuff, and I'm really excited about it. So we're always interested. So a housekeeping announcement: if you need the restroom, hopefully you can find one wherever you're watching this. Tech Systems, they're one of our sponsors, and we really appreciate them. When we used to meet in person, we had food, and they would sponsor that food, and it was great. So Courtney Elterman is our contact at Tech Systems. If you have staffing needs, please reach out to them. We really appreciate their sponsorship. We hope to meet again in person. We haven't heard a date when things are kind of back to normal with our sponsor for where we meet, which is Pivotal Labs. And once we hear we can meet in person again, we're happy to do that. And maybe we can try to figure out something to do broadcasts as well. Another sponsor is JFrog. They've been doing some awesome giveaways. They usually have a QR code you can scan and a bit.ly link, but we appreciate their sponsorship. Apex Systems was our beer sponsor, and so as I always say, tonight's liquid refreshment is sponsored by whatever's in your fridge or your beer fridge. But if you have staffing needs, again, reach out to Apex as well. We really appreciate their support. Develop Intelligence is a training organization, and we really appreciate their sponsorship too. We give away Pluralsight training, which is really amazing. I think every other month in the drawing. So if you have training needs, reach out to them. But also if you're looking to teach, they're always looking for people to hire as technical instructors. They specialize in several technologies, which include Java, Golang, JavaScript, React, DevOps stuff like Kubernetes and Docker, and some other technologies. Bob Clary is the contact that I have listed. I'm not sure if that's on the slide. Another sponsor is Amazon. Chris Almond or Sam Ayer are our contacts there. They're hiring all, full stack, so reach out to them if you're looking for work. Another sponsor is Okta. They sponsor not only the Meetup site, but and manage they sponsor the online meeting that Matt runs. And tonight's speaker is, I think, from Okta as well. It's a peer of Matt's, and we really appreciate their support. When we meet in person again, they'll probably sponsor food at the bar after the meeting, but we kind of have to wait and get to the point where we can meet in person. Another sponsor is NextGen. Dana Esland is our contact there. They are a consulting company specializing in federal government contracts. So if that's a space that you're in or you're interested in, please reach out to them. We just always appreciate our sponsors, and so anything we can do to kind of help them out, that's awesome. Another sponsor is Agile Learner, and that's Venkat's Romanian's company, and they're great. It's a great tool for learning Agile. They also will have a conference. They've been waiting for things to settle down with COVID, so I don't know when they'll be meeting in person again to have that conference, but reach out to them. Venkat is amazing. He's a speaker often for our JUG, and we really appreciate him. Another sponsor is JetBrains. So they give away a free IDE. It used to just be IntelliJ, but it's actually a well-rounded tool now that covers multiple technologies. So if you win it, you can download that suite. And it's a great deal. We really appreciate JetBrains sponsoring this drawing, this door prize for our drawing. So as far as the door prizes go, there will be a link in the chat if there isn't already. Mike will throw that out there, and that's how you can sign up for the door prizes. So I just want to do a big thank you. I just get up and talk, and that's I think that's the easiest job. So Matt Rabel is part of the DJUG board, and he gets us speakers, he does the broadcast, and we really appreciate it. And Mike Zuedo does the door prizes, and sometimes he'll run the web broadcast when Matt is, out in Cabo, for example. And Zeddy does a lot of the operational stuff, including the social media announcements and et cetera. And so I just want to thank Matt, Mike, and Zeddy for all they do to kind of make this stuff happen. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and have Matt bring up Chris Woina from the Boulder Java Users Group because they want to do a few thank yous as well. Hey, Chris.
Hey, everybody. Thanks. Just some quick similar thank yous. Tech Systems, James Corboy, America's foremost technical recruiter, Rule for Cybersecurity and Emerging Technologies. They were this year's Outdoor Magazine's one of the places to work awards. And that's where we normally meet. No Fluff, Just Stuff, and Jay Zimmerman, world-class conferences and training. Agile Developer, again, JetBrains also for us, and O'Reilly Books. I have at least a few tokens for Agile Developer for their video learning series, and also JetBrains, IntelliJ. So if anybody's interested in that, go to the Boulder Java Users Group meetup site and message me, and first come, first serve. Be sure to do that tonight. Thanks very much, Greg.
Thank you very much, Chris. So tonight's presentation, it's going to be Brian Demers on security vulnerabilities for Java developers. So, and here is the write-up about the talk. Ever seen a security-related issue that you felt should be reported? Unsure of how reporting a security issue is different than a regular bug? Developers of any level should know how to report a vulnerability. In this talk, we will talk about what CVEs are, some general vulnerability classifications, and look at a few ways you can report security issues, as well as look at a few common mistakes. Knowing how to report a vulnerability is just half the battle. You also need to keep your applications free of those vulnerabilities. We'll dig into the recent Log4Shell vulnerability and discuss lessons learned when scrambling to update versions. And again, I got to do that. Boy, that was fun. Finally, we will talk about how the scramble can be avoided by getting notifications when new security issues are announced, and how to keep your applications updated automatically. And again, this talk isn't necessarily geared towards security professionals. It's actually geared towards non-security professionals. I have some background in security with the CSSLP, but I'm really super excited about this and looking forward to the content. So about tonight's speakers. So Brian Demers is a developer advocate at Okta, a Java champion, and a PMC member for the Apache Shiro project. He spends much of his day contributing to OSS projects in the form of writing code, tutorials, blogs, and answering questions. Along with typical software development, Brian also has a passion for fast builds and automation. Away from the keyboard, Brian is a beekeeper. It's awesome, and can likely be found playing board games. You can find Brian on Twitter at Brian Demers. So thank you very much for coming out tonight, Brian, and really looking forward to this. So without further ado, Brian Demers.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate that. It's a good warm intro. I could probably skip like my next slide now, so that makes it even easier, right? So, yeah, let's share my screen here. So this is a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and it really only becomes important for a lot of folks when there's a big sort of event, right? So this last Log4Shell event, and then whatever, a few years ago, there was all of the Intel issues, and every few years we see one of these things, and but it's actually we see a lot of smaller issues all the time, right? And I'm going to get to that in a minute here. Oops, I gotta figure out how to advance my slides. There we go. So Greg just gave me a great intro, so I'm actually going to skip that because I can't do better than somebody else is introducing me. So let's get into it, right? So everybody watching this probably knows this is true, right? So all software has bugs. So if that's like a given, that's expected, and in some cases that's what keeps us employed, right? We also all know that security is hard, right? Or at least we should know that security is hard. But somehow we also expect our software to be free of security bugs, right? Those are kind of they go hand in hand, right? The more software we have, the more bugs we have. The more bugs we have, the more security issues we have. So we can't get around it. So I really want to normalize this topic of security vulnerabilities and how to deal with them, and just expect that they're going to happen. That doesn't mean you have to be happy about it, but just expect them to happen. So a few things I'm going to cover today. So we're going to cover what vulnerability is, what responsible disclosure is. If you've never heard that term, we'll get to it in a minute here. How to report issues. We're going to chat a little bit about the Log4Shell. I'm not doing a deep dive into that. There's a lot of other folks that have talked about that, but it is the latest thing, and it is very relevant to this talk. So that is what we're going to talk about. And then we're going to cover a few things that you can do for your project. Right. And again, I really want to normalize this whole what is a vulnerability, how to deal with them type thing. And of course, I'm not a lawyer. You know, if some folks are paranoid about how to report security issues, you know, with fear of legal retaliation, I typically don't worry about any of that. But, you know, this is not legal advice, right? So I probably wouldn't have a problem messaging some corporation, but I probably wouldn't call up and scare like a small mom and pop shop, right? I would probably try a more tactful way to reach out to them. So anyway, so let's get into this. So what is a vulnerability, right? So if you can see this, this is what the Oxford Dictionary has to say about it, right? So it's the quality or state of being exposed to be attacked, right? And it goes on to say that it's physical or emotional. And then we can get into sort of the computing definition, and the Wikipedia defines this more as what we're talking about today. It's a weakness that can be exploited by an attacker. So these are basically the same thing, except maybe the sort of the emotional part. But I actually get pretty emotional when people report things incorrectly to my project. So maybe they're exactly the same thing. Who knows? All right, so a really quick example before we start talking about some more involved vulnerabilities. And as a reminder, I'm not a security researcher, but I tell people that I play one on TV. So this one's silly, right? So if anyone sees this, you can see the coupon code in this URL is a number, right? So this is an actual bug that I found on Audible, whatever, a few years ago. I'm a big Audible fan. I guess every podcast you listen to pumps that. We're not doing that here. But anyway, so you can type this URL in and change that number to anything you want. And lo and behold, I have $1 million credit coupon, right, in Audible. That's not actually the case, right? This was all just displaying information. This would actually work if you weren't logged in. So, you know, what happened in the Audible sense, they sent me whatever, some coupon or something in my email. I clicked, you know, and then whatever, 4 or 5 redirects later, I end up with this, right? So they had one service that redirected me to this just to display this number on my page. Well, that's actually a vulnerability in my mind, right? So I'm doing something that I can change information on your website. Now, I couldn't exploit this. I couldn't find any like cross-site scripting or anything weird like that. They were validating that input was a number. It doesn't mean that's not susceptible for other types of related attacks, but you know, a quick look says it wasn't. But I could do something silly, like I could try to sell this coupon code on eBay, or you know, I could basically give, you know, at least Amazon support folks a hard time while I'm selling this coupon. Anyway, so Amazon never actually followed up with a fixed timeline. I followed up with them years later because I was sharing this screenshot in this presentation, and they said it was fine. They had fixed it, so it's all good. And obviously, I think everyone, at least watching this, has at least heard of this issue. This is the new buzz, the Log4Shell. You know, the similarity with the previous, this is still triggered with a simple string, right? So the famous example is you could go to Minecraft and type in a chat and with this string, and your server would be exploited. So this makes obviously my previous slide that makes that look like a toy. And I'm actually going to talk about the vulnerability severities here in a minute. But first, I want to cover some of the very basics. So I think some folks are kind of confused, like what's a vulnerability, what's a CVE, and are they different, are they the same? So basically, CVE is a way of describing a vulnerability across multiple data sources, right? You can really just think about it as it's an ID, and it has some sort of attached metadata to it, like a version, a description, and a few other bits. You know, These IDs are assigned by a numbering authority, so they're handed out by a trusted body like MITRE. Because not all vulnerabilities get a cool name like Log4Shell, right? Most of the time, we actually just use this CVE number. And sometimes the issues aren't actually vulnerabilities, right? This one on this slide is an issue that wasn't actually a problem. If I remember right, the reporter just didn't understand what Python's virtual environment was or something like that. So it just fell off into the waste here. All right, so I mentioned earlier that we really need to start thinking about normalizing these things. There are, on average, of 1,500 CVEs reported every month. And again, I don't show this graph to scare anybody. It's just the fact that this is what we're dealing with, right? So we need to be aware of that. But 1,500 a month ends up being about 50 a day. Just think about that for a minute, right? Now, that of course is not just in the Java world, right? That's across the computer spectrum. OSs, whatever, anything, right? But you can see that red line is the trend line, and that's going up, right? So I actually think the number of vulnerabilities is actually way higher than this. I think a lot of things go unreported. Obviously, I don't have data on things that aren't reported because there's no data to be had. But I would estimate that the numbers are higher. But in general, like the more software we put into the world, we know there's going to be more bugs, and more bugs means more security issues. That's just how numbers work, right? So we really just need to be aware that we need to be ready to handle all these issues. All right, the past few times I've given this talk, I've actually skipped this slide, but you've probably heard Log4Shell hit a perfect 10. So I think it's important at least to cover a little bit. So vulnerabilities have a common vulnerability scoring system. That's a mouthful, and it's a little on the complex side. And I don't think you need to worry about the actual details, right? There's a nice little calculator at NIST. You just kind of have to know 0 is basically no problem, and 10 is probably something you need to worry about. But this is a tool, right? So just another tool that we have that you can that will help you make decisions about an issue. Because there's 50 vulnerabilities a day, maybe you can't cover all of them, right? Maybe 3 of them affect your application. Which one should you worry about first? Well, maybe the one with the highest number. Maybe you really need to dig into each one and figure out how they affect your application. But this is the gist of it. So the section on the left there, the basic metric group, those are things that are constant over time and environment, right? So that's the exploitability. Is this thing vulnerable? The impact, right? So it represents the result of the vulnerability. Like in the case of Log4j, the impact is huge. I can spread malware. It's everybody's heard horror stories of this already. The middle one there is the things that change over time, but not environment. So that's things like if an exploit is active in the world, like it is with Log4Shell, then that raises the exploit. And if there was a patch, that lowers it potentially. And then the one on the right is actually interesting. That's the environment metric group. So that's actually how it affects your application. So for some issues, maybe you could block an issue with a firewall, right? Log4Shell, that's not really possible, but if there's some way you can mitigate the risk, then it would affect the score on that side. All right, one more potentially boring slide here with some acronyms, and then we'll sort of move on. I do think it's important to sort of cover some of the basics here. All right, so when a vulnerability gets reported, it has a common weakness enumeration. So that's basically just the type of vulnerability it is. And if I looked it up correctly, the 502 was Log4Shell, which is a deserialization issue. Right. Again, so this is more general, gives you just a general understanding of what the issue does. If you don't want to go read the details or try to read a whole bunch of information about it. A lot of vulnerabilities don't actually cover the vulnerability in depth, right? So you just know the classification of the issue, when the thing was fixed, and you just kind of have to see if it affects your environment. anyway, so there's like over 800 different CVEs. It's a whole tree of things, and they're kind of hard to follow in my opinion because there's so many. But they're out there. They are very useful. But the next one, the CPE, is actually interest, and I think it's a bit of a problem as far as how it maps to package managers and things. So the CPE is basically just the name. That's the name of the product. So the first one is Windows XP. Hopefully, there's a lot of folks on here that remember Windows XP, but I picked this one because there's interesting things in the version there. So this string basically encodes a lot of information, right? Service packs, like this has the architecture of the potentially affected application. And then of course we get down to log4j. So a lot of the Apache projects or anything really is going to look very similar to this in the Java world. And if you notice, this has nothing to do with the Maven coordinates, right? So if you're a Maven or Gradle fan user, you have some sort of group ID, artifact ID, and version. These two things cannot be mapped together, which I think is kind of a potential issue. And there are a bunch of tools and companies out there trying to map them together, and that's why we have all of these reporting and scanning tools we have today. But it'd be really nice if this was really just a de facto part of the report. All right, so if we were in person, I would ask a question. I would wait for all your hands to be raised, but we're not in person, so I'm not going to. So raise your hands in your living rooms. But I'm guessing most of you probably think CVEs are bad, right? And I would ask this, and I would say it's a trick question. I actually think CVEs are a good thing, right? They provide a standard way for us to talk about security issues. We know software bugs are a fact of life, so it's really how we handle them that makes them good or bad, right? And we need some way to be able to talk about them, to share information, right? So we can do something good and handle them. So this is Apache Tomcat. So it's obviously the ever popular Java web server, and I think it's a great example of how CVEs are reported. So the project has a security page, and it lists all the vulnerabilities for each version. And then you can go to a standard database like MITRE or NIST to find this information too. The biggest information is you can find this info, right? The biggest point, is you can find the info. It gives developers and system admins notice to go update and patch your system. And of course, it's not all good, right? So everyone has heard horror stories of cyber attacks, especially very recently, data breaches, working overtime, whatever you want to call it, right? Like it's obviously not fun. We do not want our applications to be affected, but the truth is they will be, right? And we need to make sure we handle these issues correctly. And like I said, sometimes when these things are announced, it means you have to put in some extra time, right? Or in this case, maybe over the holidays. And if we think, back a few years to Spectre and those types of issues, it was a massive pain in the ass, right? Folks worked overtime. There was cases of decreased performance, and that cost people money. They had to, spin up more servers or get larger CPUs or whatever it was. They're a pain, but it is a fact of life. All right, so let's go quickly over the sort of a high level overview of how vulnerability is reported and the timeline of such, right? So the first thing that happens is, and this is the ideal scenario, right? So the first thing that happens is an issue is reported. So hopefully it's some security reporter reaching out correctly to a project that says, hey, I found this issue. We think you should fix it. And then they kind of wait for a response. Maybe there's some back and forth, right? The vendor or open source project or whatever it is agrees. They fix the project, and sometimes if they're hosting services, they'll apply the fix or ship code or whatever it is, and then after the code is available, they will disclose the issue publicly. So this is the first time folks know that the issue is announced. And we're going to go over how the log4shell issue went down in a few minutes. So bear with me. We're going to walk through some of the ideals. I'm going to quickly go through each one of these in a little more detail here. So But first, I do want to cover responsible disclosure, right? So disclosure of in itself is the act of making secret information known. So responsible disclosure, or some folks call it coordinated disclosure, basically means you want to keep something a secret until that issue can be fixed within some agreed upon time, right? This is opposed to full disclosure, which is tell everybody right now, right away, everything. So there's kind of a balance between the two, right? So full disclosure gives users and admins all the information they need to make their own decisions, but it also gives the attackers the same information. And to be honest, attackers are more likely to be able to exploit this issue, whereas an admin might not be able to do anything about it until a patch has been released. Right. So thinking again back to Log4Shell, in the case of that, we actually knew about the issue before we had the fix, right? So a lot of people are scrambling. They just couldn't do anything about it. So we felt like we were kind of sitting on our hands, waiting for a patch to be released, or going to build something, or running Java agents or whatever it was to try to mitigate the issue. Anyway, my view is responsible disclosure is the best option in almost all cases. It's really easy to disclose information, and it's impossible to take it back. So even if you think you really need to, use full disclosure, maybe start with full disclosure. And if you're, for whatever reason, you feel you need to get more information out there, if there's already an exploit in the wild or something, then maybe full disclosure is best. But start with responsible disclosure. All right. So again, going back to the front of my timeline, we report things. We report things privately. That's really the important part. So if you stop this talk now, you say, yes, if I have to report an issue, I do it privately. Great. That's all I really want you to know about anything. I joke a little. I think you should watch the rest of it. But the problem is every project does this differently. So you have to go search out a project or vendor's website for the information. Maybe they have a security mailing list. Maybe they have a bug bounty site. It's everybody does something different. It's really hard to narrow it down. And for smaller shops, maybe they don't have any, a security team, right? So you have to go email support and then figure out how you should actually communicate to that team and to get to the right people. And it's a pain. And of course, I mentioned this before. If you're a little paranoid and you want to stay anonymous, that's totally fine. You can use an anonymous email account or something. And like I said, I wouldn't typically worry about it now, but if you're doing something a bit gray, maybe you should. All right. Again, do not use a public bug tracker. This is an issue that I helped fix a while back. The reporter opened this issue and basically just ghosted us. A lot of folks will scan public repositories and, to pad a resume or whatever. And I'm actually all for that. I think if you want to do that and pad your resume, awesome. Just report them correctly, work with teams so they can fix the issues, disclose them correctly. And then nobody has a problem giving credit to the initial reporter, right? But it's not just bug trackers. I've seen the same thing on mailing lists and Stack Overflow. People have reported lots of vulnerabilities in Stack Overflow, right? That is definitely not private. Like I said, once the information is public, there's no going back. You can't do anything to take it back. And I would also caution some bug trackers out there have like a private checkbox. It's still really hard to tell if it's just limited to a security team. So I would still keep searching out that product or vendor's website or whatever, looking for their security policy and figure out how they want you to report an issue. And this actually still happens. So this was one of the issues with Log4Shell, right? So this was actually open before the issue was fixed. This doesn't actually disclose any information about it. It doesn't say there's a vulnerability. It does hint that there's a potential issue, right? So I would say if you are working on a project, don't open a public issue until the issue's been fixed, right? There should be no notice of this out there at all. And I'm going to get into that a little more in detail in a minute here. But But yeah, so then you fix the issue, right? So the issue's been reported, great. Now the project or vendor or whatever has to go fix the issue. So at this point, it's totally fine to get involved. I mentioned this before, you just kind of need to be careful. We can't really, we need to be careful about the messaging in public pull requests, right? You can't say, I'm fixing vulnerability XYZ, right? That's a big flag to everybody that says that. You may need to go back to old school emailing patches around. And so until the project team sort of figures it out, or maybe you have a private GitHub repo that you've been invited to. There's a lot of ways that we can pass code around nowadays that's not public. So this is one of those times that you know, kind of need to take a step back and think about what you're doing. So after the fix has been in, right? So now we go through whatever release process that means. So for Java projects, if it's an open source library or whatever, you typically push to Maven Central or some other binary, right? Microsoft might, you know, just include a patch on Patch Tuesday. And there's a whole bunch of projects that are source based, like PHP, that will just cut a tag and call it done, right? So I do want to point out sort of the time between reporting and the fixing, or the time between, the time between reporting and announcing that the thing has been fixed, is called a security embargo. So that's the period of time that you have to fix the issue that we're trying to keep minimal eyes on it, right? So how long this actual embargo, how long you give a project to fix an issue, it really depends on who you ask, right? So Google's Project Zero, I think, has a default of 90 days, but they've actually disclosed issues as low as 7 days, and they waited 8 months in the case of Spectre, right? So Spectre was finally leaked, I think, through some sort of Linux kernel issue or something. But 8 months is a long time, and that's, you know, the longer you wait, the more eyeballs you have on something. The Linux kernel is actually interesting. It's actually like 2 weeks, but I think officially it's 19 days, which basically they just wanted to give everybody a few extra days, you know, for weekends and holidays, and people have lives, right? So you got to kind of accommodate for people. But I like to think about it just in general, like how long does it take you to fix a non-security related issue, right? If you had to fix a bug tomorrow, how quick can you get it out to a customer? Is it days? Is it weeks? Is it months? Right? I've definitely worked on projects that hit every one of those. So, you know, if you can't get a project out, if you can't get a fix out within months, that's a problem all by itself. But you know, it's something to think about. And going back to the Linux kernel, right? That project, the GitHub project, which is a fork, right? The official kernel has 40,000 forks on GitHub, and it has more than 120,000 stars. That's a lot of eyeballs in this project, right? And this is one of my favorite quotes here. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead, right? So, you know, the more people who see it, the harder it is to keep something a secret. So, you know, obviously you want to fix an issue as soon as possible, tell everybody right away, but we have to be realistic about it too. All right, so we fixed the issue. We have the release out. Now it's time to disclose. This is the first time we tell the public about the issue. This is what, you know, a vendor or an open source project, they're going to do all of this for you. So if you've reported an issue, you've sort of kind of washed your hands of it in the beginning. You don't have to do anything after that. They're going to manage, the vendor's going to manage all of the CVE creation and all that stuff for you, announcements, whatever they have to do, right? Once it's released, though, that's when you can blog about it if you want. You know, you can go tell your friends you're a security researcher now, or not. You know, I know some companies will actually pay you money if you don't talk about it, so that's an option too. But another resource that I use all the time. Obviously, I work in a lot of Apache projects, so they actually have a great detailed list. This is the one I'm most familiar with. There's a few things in here that are Apache specific, but I think it's clear enough to replicate for other projects too. You know, a slight tweak. I've definitely used this for non-Apache projects. You can obviously just remove some of the bits. And if your company or your project doesn't have a way to handle vulnerabilities, go check this out and then, you know, copy and paste and tweak a few lines, and there you go. You'll have a policy for yourself. All right. So I want to take a quick break here and tell everyone I am definitely not trying to pick on anybody in the Log4j team. Getting through this whole thing was rough, and we really do need to thank them, right? If anyone is upset with anybody on the Log4j team, how they handle the issue, whatever, anything, I would first suggest you actually go help out your favorite open source project, volunteer to patch issues, help with documentation, whatever that is, right? Remember, like, these people have lives, families, day jobs, whatever. We need to give them a break, right? I mentioned this before. All software is bugs. Security's hard. You're gonna have security issues. We just need to deal with it and expect them to happen, and we need to be able to act quickly to get past it. That said, it is a great example to start talking about, right? So that's what we're doing. Obviously, we're sprinkling Log4Shell throughout this whole thing, but I do want to touch on the actual Log4Shell timeline and talk about how it differs from the ideal that I talked about a few minutes ago. All right, so here's the story as I know it, right? It's really hard to piece out some of this information, but this is what it looks like, right? So Alibaba's cloud security team reported the issue to the Log4j team directly, right? That happened on the 24th of November. That's great. Everything so far, so good. Right? That's they privately reported it. Then we start getting potential issues here, right? I mentioned there was an issue, a public Jira issue. There was also pull requests, commits. All of those things triggered emails. Those emails are indexed in list servers and crawled through Google. Like, that information is out there, right? Now, they probably didn't directly call out the fact that it's a vulnerability. But if anybody's watching, right, there's a lot of eyeballs on that project. It's a popular project. So if you were looking to exploit a ton of software, that's probably a good one, good project to pay attention to. So the information is out there. Now, that is not to say there could be parallel paths to this issue, right? So we had an exploit. 2 days later? Cloudflare has evidence of the exploit being live on the 1st, and Cisco has noticed issues on the 2nd. So that's, if they troll back through their logs, that's the earliest they've seen it. This is very possible that, the initial report could have been leaked some other way. Alibaba's cloud security team could have heard it from somebody else. They could have seen an issue in their log files. Like, there's a ton of other ways that this could have become public, right? This issue had been out there since 2013. So I'm not saying that it's this public commit that disclosed the issue, but timeline wise, it is something we need to pay attention to. All right. So anyway, so the exploit's out. This is where we all start panicking, right? It's the holidays, November. Like, we're really trying to coast in through the end of the year, and now a lot of folks are working overtime, right? And it actually wasn't like till a week later that we actually get the fix out, right? So that's a potential problem, So let's talk about what we can do for our projects to help sort of streamline this and make sure that we're ready to deal with these things in the future, right? Many of us work on open source projects, or our commercial projects that we work on in our day jobs depend on open source projects, or whatever it is, right? You have projects, maybe you have public bug trackers, maybe they're private, it doesn't matter. You have some sort of public facing component, or maybe that public is just other teams within your company, right? Maybe you work at a company that's 10,000 people and you're supporting, software for them. There's still a lot of eyeballs and a lot of people using your software, and disgruntled employee type potential problems. Anyway, we need to talk about what we can do for our users and our customers. All right, so first up is our dependencies. Now, if you remember my topic slide way in the beginning, I listed code first, right? And I did that kind of on purpose because that's probably what you care about the most. But I would argue that that's sort of second class, right? the vast majority of your application is probably made up of dependencies, right? It's code that you didn't write, you don't manage, and it definitely has bugs. We know it's software. We know it has bugs. Because it has bugs and it's software, it probably has potential security issues, right? So we need to plan ahead for these. And I'm not saying don't use these things, right? I'm saying that we need to expect it. We need to be ready for these things to happen. But we also, especially as Java folks, right, we also kind of think about our dependencies as like, this is what I get from Maven Central, right? Like I'm a big fan of Maven. It literally says dependency in my plum file. Like that's what I think about when I think about dependencies, right? And the same is true if you are using NPM or NuGet or whatever other package manager. You're kind of hyper focused on sort of your language community. But we really do need to take a step back and think about dependencies are everything our applications depend on, right? So hopefully we've all seen this great XKCD comic, right? Everything's held up by that one little project. In this case, it's log4j. But it's we need to think about everything, right? So we often again think about that it's just libraries, right? But it's not. It's not just our libraries. Your application has a bunch of libraries. That code all runs on a JVM, right? Maybe that JVM runs in a Docker container. I don't know what your system is. But that runs on some operating system, or maybe that operating system runs in a virtual machine, right? All this code just to start the application. We haven't even talked about any other system that your application interacts with, right? If you're building web apps, your user submits some request to your browser or whatever, and how many services does it hit just to get to your application, right? Is there gateways, firewalls, load balancers, all of those things, right? All of those are dependencies of your application, whether you like it or not. If those things are vulnerable, there's potential issues passed into your application. And it doesn't actually stop there too. I'm actually still a big fan of CodeCove, but if you are familiar with the CodeCove supply chain issue that came out, whatever, last year, 2 years ago, whatever it was nowadays, basically there was an issue with how CodeCove was recommending to install their tool. It's basically a bash file that you piped into bash, and an attacker got control of that, and they can replace it with something malicious, right? So now those leaked out, and that code actually had control of your environment variables, right? That malicious code can then just send your environment variables somewhere else. There was often security keys in those things, and then attackers can then use them to access, GitHub or whatever else you were doing, right? So, along with our dependencies, we really need to think about our builds and our tool chains, and we really need to be ready to at a moment's notice to rotate our keys, update our dependencies, all these things. All right, and this one is a bit of my pet peeves, but it's related. If it's not, it's a pet peeve of mine, so I'm gonna take this opportunity to complain about it. It's impossible to run a secure application on insecure hardware, right? I've worked on a handful of Java projects that are targeting Java libraries that target Java 1.7 because of Android, right? People who are consuming these libraries really feel they need to target Android 6, and they want to run secure software on Android 6, which hasn't had a security update since 2018. You can't do that, right? Like there's that thing is full of malware at this point, or at least you have to assume it is. You can't run secure software on an insecure system, right? So I feel like Android, at least for a while, hopefully now that Java 17 is out, I feel like that was one of the reasons that people were sort of holding back. But now, newer versions of Java, Kotlin, hopefully that sort of makes the Android community happy. Anyway, but I'm really not picking on Android. The same problem goes for any of your other libraries, right? If you're using some library or some system that doesn't get updates, you probably want to start looking for an alternative. All right, so this is a surefire way to have less vulnerabilities in the code you write. You just write less of it. Right? I think it's obvious, right? I like, I should say right here, thank you for coming to my TED talk. I'm done, right? Like, no, but I'm not talking about like no code solutions or anything like that. I'm talking about using the components you have, using things that you're already in control to solve your needs, right? 20 something year old me would have definitely laughed at this advice. Though to be fair, when I was in my 20s, we had a lot less options than we do today. Really today, if you're building Java software, you really should be building on top of a framework, right? Spring Boot, Quarkus, Micronaut. There's a bunch of other options. I'm not trying to pick favorites, but anyway, pick something that security is baked into. That's not an afterthought, right? And of course, I work at a security company, but I'm not selling a product. I really want to drive this one home. But if you're building code that's doing something like really low level, like hashing passwords or something similar, right? You really need to take a step back and think about why you're spending your time on that stuff instead of buying something or using an OSS alternative. You really shouldn't be doing these low level things anymore. And if you are, probably try to work with a community that's also doing these things. Unless that's your core business. If your core business has these types of security issues, then go for it.
All right, Brian, we got a
All right,
question
I
for
saw
you.
you jumped in. What do you got?
It's a doozy. How
Uh-oh.
would you relate your beekeeping experience to an incident or exploit at scale, like a
Oh,
DOS?
that's perfect. Yeah, yeah. So,
It's like a
um,
softball.
oh, it really is. I mean, that's just lobbed in. A couple years ago, I've only been keeping bees for I don't know 4 or 5 years now. But a couple of years ago, I had this mean hive. Like, and depending on the type of bee you have, like there's all kinds of genetics and if the hive is healthy or whatever. But you can do a little Googling and find people with similar issues. But I had a hive that was mean, man, and I would come out, I would crack that thing open, and they would sting me. And I wear like nitrile gloves, like doctor gloves or whatever, but I still have a veil and a coat. But they would crawl up my legs and sting me. They were mean. I mean, it was definitely denial of service. I would close that sucker back up and I would move to the next one. So hopefully that answers the question. All right, I like that one. All right, so moving on, right? So if you're allergic to bees, maybe you should see a doctor too. But are your dependencies healthy? I was definitely not healthy after getting stung. I usually don't swell up too much either, but a couple times with that hive, I definitely got frustrated, and my arms were swelling. I got stung right here once, and then it all like covered my eyeball. It was terrible. Anyway, so we really need to think about the health of all of our dependencies, right? So do these projects get regular updates? Do they have active communities? They have mailing lists, forums, right? Like, are you going to get support? And by support, I mean answers, right? You can't expect an open source project to give you support, but if there's a vulnerability, you gotta hope that community is going to be on top of things. So are they likely to be on top of things, right? If they're not, you probably should find some alternative. And along with writing less code, we really need to try to keep our dependencies to a minimum. And that probably seems counterintuitive, right? If I'm writing less code and I'm keeping my dependencies to a minimum, like aren't those polar opposites? And I would say no, especially today, right? So if you're building a Spring application, you probably don't need to use their Commons Lang or Guava's string util classes, right? You can probably use what's in Spring, right? Or vice versa, right? Like, there's a lot available to you already. Like I work on JJWT, and I also do a lot of work with Spring Security and Okta. Spring Security uses a different JWT library. So for our project, we made sure we worked with their JWT library, right? Nobody wants to pull in extra stuff. And even though I think the other one's better, right? That's the personal opinion, but nobody wants to have two of those things, especially JWT library, to be fair. Like, there's JWTs are always in the news. But anyway, so keep your dependencies to a minimum. It's just fewer things you need to worry about updating. And we really need to think about our transitive dependencies, right? So this is a dependency tree of a minimal Spring Boot 3 application. I just tried this out the other day. So this is without security. So this is literally just enough code to handle a REST request. My Maven POM basically had one direct dependency, and the rest are pulled in, right? Those are my transitive dependencies, or they're the dependencies of my dependencies, right? So you can see my one dependency spools out pretty quick into a whole lot of other things. And another interesting factoid I heard today. So 30% of the Log4j versions that are downloaded on Maven Central right now are vulnerable to Log4Shell. So that means a ton of people are not updating their dependencies. All right, 30%. Now, hopefully those are things that are nobody's using. Maybe they're just, I don't know, CI server somewhere. We can hope, but you got to kind of assume that's not the case. That software running somewhere that somebody's working on. They just don't even realize they have a Log4j dependency. But you need a plan to keep these things up to date. You know, and how often do you update your dependencies? Do you do it regularly? Right? There are a lot of great options now to do that. There are tools like Dependabot or Sneak has tools. Those things will send you pull requests to update your dependencies automatically. There's the OAuth dependency check that will scan your dependencies, your Maven or Gradle dependencies. You can use the Maven versions plugin to automatically update everything. Whatever you're doing, you need to have some sort of tool to do it. I'm a firm believer, and you can't do this without some sort of automation. You can try it out. You know, you can say you're going to do it, but then whatever, 2 months later, when you're working on your next project, you've forgotten about it. And another thing I think people forget about all the time is that if we scan our code, right? So if I'm keeping my main branch up to date, vulnerability free, awesome, right? But if I'm only pushing that code to production once a month, that doesn't really help me, right? So my production code is now vulnerable to all these things for about a month, right? So we really need to think about what's actually running, likely more than what's actually just in our code bases, right? So now if you're rolling out every other day, that's fine, right? But if you're pushing things to customers and you have a really long, test process, you're really going to start bumping up against these issues the next time one of these things happens, like Log4Shell. It's going to happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen through Log4j, but there's going to be another big thing that we all have to scramble with, and we're going to see more and more of them. Or maybe we just see a ton of small ones. Either way, you have to be ready for it. So another interesting bit. So Cisco, when Heartbleed came out, it took them 50 days just to figure out what software they had that was affected. Think about that. 50 days just to say that this software, this piece, and that piece all are affected by Heartbleed, right? And then it was several weeks after that to patch everything, right? So they've upped their game, which is good. And when Log4Shell came out, they had things identified in a couple days, and they had all their on-prem products patched within 2 weeks. But I still think 2 weeks is a really long time. But I mean, that's a pretty big vendor to be able to say all of their on-prem stuff. So I definitely think that's a huge improvement. Again, so all comes down to management of your application, right? So if you Google it, it would be like the buzzwords are lifecycle management, and more buzzwords. It'd be like shift left and all this other stuff. I'm really trying to shy away from the buzzwords here, but we're really all talking about the same thing. We really need to move these things earlier in our process and use automation to deal with it. Another thing that I think is going to get a lot more traction in the near future is an Sbomb. So this is not to be confused with a Maven bomb, which is like we typically use to import our dependencies. In the Spring world, this is like the dependencies bomb, or if you're using Jackson, it's literally like Jackson-bomb. There's a lot of those types of things. This is a software bill of materials. It's something the U.S. government is pushing for. It's XML, because we love XML. I think there's a JSON version of it too. But anyway, so it's basically just there to list out your dependencies, right? This is the ingredients of your breakfast cereal, right? So if you ship a product to somebody, they would have an Sbomb for that product. So then if something like, Log4Shell is announced, they can be like, yep, I have, these 3 pieces of software are affected by this issue. And then at least they can target, they can figure out what to do to help mitigate that until there's an issue, a patch. Or maybe they can just figure out when a patch is released, they'll figure out what services to prioritize to be updated, right? So related story. So a friend of mine, when Log4Shell was announced, called me up looking for advice. He was a bit panicked. He's an IT director at a school system. So remember, school systems, we need to fund our school systems, fund the IT departments of your school system. But he really had no way to figure out what systems were affected, right? And I couldn't give him any advice. I started telling him that you could do some fancy file searching, and then I'm like, well, there's so many other ways you can include a jar file in your project, right? So you could have a jar of jar files, or you could have a war file, or you could have a shaded jar, or you could have an obfuscated jar. Like, there's so many things out there that it's really next to impossible to figure out unless you know something was using Log4j, right? But I feel like something like an Sbomb probably would have helped in his case. And of course, even if we have these tools, we still sort of need management in place to figure out, he'd have to have some sort of site survey plan to figure out how many of these things he had. And there's still work to be done, right? Even if we have this Sbomb in place. But I feel like it's one of those things that at least we're pushing in the right direction. All right, so let's talk about code, right? Ironically, this is probably the thing you're most interested in, and it's the section that I have the fewest slides on. So, but remember, think back to that circle. This is the smallest portion of that circle, right? We all think our code is beautiful, right? At least to wait a couple of weeks and you come back to it, and then you're like, oh, what was I thinking? You're pulling your hair out. At least that's how I write code. I don't know how you write code, but I still come into contact with a lot of folks that don't have any tests for their code. This boggles my mind. You're talking at a conference and someone comes up to you and you're like, how do I get my developers to write code? And I'm blown away by that, right? Like, I don't know, if your company doesn't like to write tests or I don't know, has no sort of plan to do that, it's probably time to go look elsewhere. Everybody's hiring right now, so now's a good time to make a move. But anyway, so there are other things to do too, right? There's static analysis, there's other testing, there's you could do audits and security reviews. I've had mixed results with audits and security reviews. I've definitely had cases where I've had an audit that was awesome. They found issues that I was definitely not aware of, like timing attack type related issues. It was definitely helpful to find another set of eyes. But I've also been on the other side where a security review is like somebody grepping for the word password and things like that, right? So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying those aren't useful. It's just, you got to kind of take it with a grain of salt. Like if you have somebody, a great security team that's doing thorough reviews, that's awesome. And you should totally do that. And there are a handful of other tools, right? I'm not covering a lot of these types of tools right now, but OWASP has a bunch of tools, and I know Z-Attack Proxy comes up a bunch of times, but there are a whole bunch of ways to test the service area of your application looking for other exploits, right? And that's all dependent on the type of application you're building. But one way that I think that will work well for a lot of Java code is static analysis tools. You really should be scanning your code with something. You don't have to use my favorite tools. I would say something is better than nothing, right? We're really trying to really lower our risk. It's never going to be zero. But I really like spot bugs and specifically find sec bugs. So if you're not familiar with spot bugs, the previous name of the project was find bugs, which is why find sec bugs starts with find, not spot. But it's a plugin for the other one, and it's if you're confused by what I just said, that's what happens. But anyway, go check out spot bugs and find sec bugs. But there's also PMD, and there's a bunch of other static analysis tools that you can check out too. And there are a whole bunch of commercial tools right now. So there's Sneak, there's SonarQube, there's Veracode, and there's a whole list. And I would absolutely recommend you checking out something. Find something that works with your application.
All right, I got a
However,
question.
oh, all right, let's do it.
This is from Matt Henry. Another team did a heap analysis, and the tool told them that objects should not hold on to plain text credentials at runtime. What do I do? And then, so what he follows it up with is, I want to be able to inject credentials into config classes and pass them to an interceptor for use during the life of the app. Is it not that simple anymore?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So the general advice, right, is use a character array. But if you can't inject that thing, it depends on your framework how it's being held onto. But to be honest, if it's in there for the life of your software, it can definitely be dumped out. But the part of the problem is if your strings will stay there forever, right? So if you're doing a lot of strings, a lot of passwords, like a user password, but I don't know. I think that one's one of those ones you got to balance. Like if you can use a character array, do it. If you can't, you got to balance the risk, right? Like who has access to your heap dump, right? It could be anybody on that machine. It's a definitely non-zero risk, but all these things you just got to balance the pros and cons.
And it's a good point. I actually learned this a couple of years ago, and I've been doing security for a while, right? And that is that if you were to print or log a plain text, like password is a string, it'll print it out. But if it's a character array, it doesn't, right? So that's the first easy safeguard there.
Absolutely. I think there's a whole host of things that can be found. Actually, that's one of the next things I want to talk about. So I think one of the best things that I've done, I briefly mentioned find sec bugs, but I turn these things on in my IDE, and there's a lot of those types of issues, specifically around strings and dealing with strings and printing them, and that your IDE will warn you, right? And other static analysis things will warn you too, but it's there's a lot of passive learning that happens, right? I write a lot of code, right? I'm the type of person who will write a ton of code, and I'll try to go delete 90% of it, right? Like, I don't know, I'll try things, delete it, try things, delete it. But the more code you write, the more things you're like, oh, why is my IDE yelling at me? So find sec bugs has totally taught me a lot of things, and they're like, oh, this line of code looks terrible. So I look it up, I read the description, I'm like, oh, I should remember that one, and then I start writing better code. So I definitely think that's another way that we as developers can learn too. All right, so there's one more sad bit of truth I do want to drop on everybody. That's I also heard recently that all of these tools, right, all of the even commercial tools, open source tools, none of them would have found this specific log4shell issue, right? So that means you could be doing everything in the world, but you're not going to bring your risk of being vulnerable down to zero ever. It's just not going to happen. We need to realize that vulnerabilities are a fact of life, and I know I've been repeating this throughout the whole talk, but that's kind of the point, right? We need to expect them both in your code and your dependencies. And we need to make sure we provide a way for our users to responsibly report them, right? So this could be, again, going back to what I said earlier, you need to provide a mailing list or something for your users to report issues. And of course, along with updating all your dependencies and keeping everything, the hygiene of your application up to date. But the actual reporting of a vulnerability for your product is tricky. There's no standard way of doing it. I mentioned this before. Everybody does something different, and this is painful. So I feel like it's getting better, but everybody's doing something different, right? And again, this still applies to if you're building internal software, right? You work at a company with 10,000 people, you probably still need some sort of policy. So if you're using GitHub, I really like this approach. So this is what Spring Security does, and I've tried to steal this in a couple places. But you basically you want to put like an unobtrusive reminder at the top of your GitHub issue template, right? It's basically a comment if they don't delete it, nobody sees it when the markdown is rendered, but it's an HTML comment in markdown, so it can be forgotten about. But again, it's a gentle nudge to point people that like, hey, if you have a security issue, go over here. Don't put that stuff here. You know, this is not the place for security issues. And you know, again, I keep going back to GitHub. A lot of us are on GitHub. There are very similar ways to do this in other source control things, but hopefully we're all familiar with GitHub, so you know you can use these ideas elsewhere too. But you should define a security policy when possible. All right. So the goal is you want to point people to the right place as easy as possible. So that means sprinkling this information everywhere. And again, this is just a simple markdown file that you know, just link off to a policy. You're still updating your policy in one place. You can host that on your own corporate website or whatever it is, or your open source projects website. But you're getting that link in front of people everywhere. And this is another one of my favorites. So securitytext.org, right? So this you can go to this website, and they have a little form for you to fill out, and you can have one of these files generated in like 10 seconds. It's very similar to how robots.txt works. You drop it in the root of your website, and it's easily discoverable by folks. I forget, it was a few months ago. I found a minor issue on somebody's website. It wasn't really a vulnerability. It was more of like an anti-pattern, but I was trying to notify them, right? So I couldn't find their security policy anywhere. But you know, I was like, whatever. Maybe they have a security.txt file, and sure enough, they did. So it was like something like white hat at something. You know, it was very obvious that that's what the email alias was for. I emailed them. We talked about the issue, and they said, yeah, they'll work on it, and they understood it wasn't super pressing, but it was an issue, and it was very easy. This type of thing can be baked into tools, right? It can be baked into browser extensions. It's just something that we can easily do, machine readable, and discoverable. So I think these are the types of things we need to push for. And then, of course, you know, if you're a commercial piece of software, you use one of the bug bounty sites, right? I would absolutely rather pay someone to find a bug than hit the front page of Hacker News, right? I mean, obviously, this path doesn't work for everybody, but definitely consider all your options. All right, so this is just the tip of the iceberg of all these security concerns. You know, we've touched on like how to report a vulnerability. Your dependencies, update your dependencies. Please automate updating your dependencies. If you didn't catch that, you should update your dependencies. Yeah, that in security requires special handling, right? So we really need to be ready at a moment's notice to update our applications. And as I touched on this before, we're definitely going to see more and more large security issues, and we need to be ready for it. So that's it. So bring on the questions. What else do we have?
I don't see any currently. You answered them all.
Oh, right. Well, it's easy peasy, right?
We have some trivia. Did you know CPE also means continuing professional education?
Oh, we do a terrible job at this. It's every day goes by, and I'm like, that's something else. Like if we come up with something, you know, it's hard to Google. I used to work on certain types of Nexus, and then Google came out with a phone called Nexus, and it's like, well, there goes that, right? Like our search index just totally tanked. You can't beat Google a Google product on a Google search.
All right, so I'm going to bring up Greg and Chris. Maybe they have some questions for you.
I did have a comment. Brian, you asked, are CVEs bad? And I was thinking, that's like saying, is a medical checkup bad? I mean, it could highlight a timely vulnerability for your health that you've got to address, something you don't even realize that's an issue. And
absolutely.
I had a question on two questions on your beekeeping. Do you not like have a rubber band around your pants, or it doesn't matter, they still get through?
You know, when I started, I literally bought a bag of those giant like rubber bands from Staples or whatever it was, and I used them probably 3 times, and I was like, it's no big deal, like whatever, like, So yeah, I've definitely been stung on the ankle my fair share of times. At this point, like beekeeping is one of those weird uh, things where there's a lot of myth, right? Like before the show, we were talking about um, smoking meat, right? Everybody's got all these myths, and like it's really hard to get facts out of just this is the way I've been doing it for years. So what I read is you as a beekeeper you want to be stung a few times throughout the year.
Okay.
To help your immunity. I have no idea if that's true, right? I definitely get stung a few times throughout the year.
I think that was written by somebody that got stung a lot.
Right.
So I was going to tell you, so I did a scout project for the troop that my kids were in, and it was a transient beehive. So there's bees that don't have a hive, and this is sort of how they continue to survive during the winter months. And so that was really cool. It's going to be at the local high school. And I wanted to know what flavors you have. A friend of mine has a couple of hives, and one is like a clove kind of flavor. I know it depends on the flowers, right?
Yeah, so my area is mostly just wildflowers. So legally, I can only list it as wildflower honey.
Yeah, all right, so we got a couple questions rolling in here. So, what do you or would you do about a medium or high vulnerability flagged by a tool that is managed by Spring Boot?
That's a good question.
Just wait for the next boot version, or try to mitigate given their frequent releases?
Yeah, so Spring Boot's a good example because they have frequent releases. So I think it really depends if it's something that's going to affect your application. Excuse me. So, if they're going to put out a release in 2 days, right, and it's going to take you whatever 3-4 days to roll out a release, test it, make sure things are working, then maybe you just wait. But if it's something like on the scale of Log4Shell, you need to get that thing patched as soon as humanly possible, right? So if that means bumping your dependencies, it's fine. In a lot of cases, right? Like this was really popular with Jackson, right? So I forget which version of Jackson it was, like 2.10 or whatever it was. There was a lot of like gadget type exploits that were seen in the wild. That I think it was like an allow list versus using a deny list or something like that they changed in one of the previous versions. But we were getting new versions of Jackson, every few days, every couple of weeks, right? So it was really onto the developer at that point to manage the version of Jackson versus letting your framework do it. But it's at that level, it's all like patch level compatibility, right? So it's not really much of a risk.
So we got another question from Keith here. When you say minimize dependencies, have you seen projects that have forks to swap in dependencies to minimize downtime during a CVE that is not fixed yet?
Yes, yeah, it's definitely that actually used to be even more common. I don't know, I would say a few years back, but I've definitely seen that. It's harder to do, but a lot of like corporations that actually host their own like Maven repository will definitely do that. And things that have become out of date, it's not uncommon. Like I know folks who have used like older versions of, I forget what it was. Maybe it was also Jackson that they were using like the old, what was it, Faster XML? What was the old name for Jackson? Anyway, the old annotation name. Maybe it was Codehouse packages or Codehouse packages, right. Whatever. Anyway, whatever it was. So they had to fork it and basically just manage it that way. So it's definitely a burden. So it's to everybody's benefit to try to push that stuff upstream. So if you can work with that community to get that in place, hopefully that will help them get it done faster versus everybody duplicating work. But if it's a big issue and critical to your project, and you have the ability to do it, I would probably do it internally, and then also still recommend making sure you can push the change upstream.
All right, now we got one for me. Awkward. The guy's asking, or lady, I'm not sure, Donal. Sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. If I'm still doing framework smackdowns, either front end or JVM, and one of my current favorites and all that. So no credit for it depends. I have been doing one lately that actually people have liked, and it's funny because it was probably one of the the fastest blog post I wrote. Took me like 2 hours, and it was a comparison of like Quarkus and Micronaut and Spring Boot and like their native performance and stuff like that. But the reason it only took me 2 hours to write is Brian and I had been doing research on it for like 6 months or maybe even a year, trying to like make a lot of the Graal VM stuff work with these various frameworks. And so I will post a link in the chat for that. And I'll be doing that again at Devoxx France. So I'm excited to go to Paris for that. And Brian and I are doing a security talk at DevNexus. So we're both excited that these in-person events are starting to happen again.
Absolutely.
We got another one from Juan here. What are your thoughts about the log4shell guidance to delete classes out of log4j core jar files? I didn't hear that one.
Yeah, that was an early on like mitigation. I think that's fine, like early on, right? Like because the exploit was announced and it was in the wild, right? So at that point, you're just kind of scrambling, you know. So I think those types of things, or there was also a Java agent that did something similar that you attach to your application. Those are good like short-term mitigations, but they're not long-term things. It's super easy to forget them, right? If you were like, oh, I just deleted that class, and then whatever, the next time you have to go do something and you roll out that application, now your application is vulnerable to log4shell again, right? And you've totally forgot about it. And you know, the botnets are going to be scanning for this vulnerability forever. So it's definitely not something you want to lose track of. So I would say, you know, if something like this comes up again and that's like, you know, the 2-day fix, and you really have your processes in place that you will absolutely remember to fix it, then I think it's fine. But if there's anything else you can do, I would do that instead.
Cool. Chris or Greg, do you have any questions for Brian?
No, first of all, this is really great. I think a lot of people don't know kind of this process. And I was going to say on the log4shell, I know those people deleted the classes out, but I don't know how soon after it was, but I got a jar that fit the need for what I had that kind of turned those things off. So no, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
I would just
That's
say,
fun.
I would just want to add that security professionals and security vendors are a good thing. And it's really, as a developer, it's hard to stay on top of this stuff. And if your company can have an annual audit, bring in a vendor, do something like that, if they don't have an on-premises security professional, it's money well spent.
Well, and I work for the state, and we actually have Veracode baked in, which does the top 10 OWASP stuff. So that's a part of our DevOps process. Is it checks all that stuff before we push as a part of our DevOps pipeline.
So if you're watching this particular, talk on YouTube, notice Brian's name is actually his Twitter handle. So if you have any security questions, make sure and send him a direct message.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and end the broadcast here. And thank you very much for joining us, Brian.
Well, thanks for having me.
Cheers.